Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is episode 50 of season 1. Today we look at the rise of the Vijayanagara kingdom and the impact that it had on the Bangalore region and how it led to the creation of the modern city of Bengaluru. Over the next 2 episodes, I will frame the history of this dynasty as it relates to our history rather than as a comprehensive view of their entire history. But that said, it is tempting to talk at length about Vijayanagara because there's an undefinable something, a je ne sais quoi, about that kingdom's story that catches one's fancy and imagination. But before I take that flight though, you must allow me pause to thank the Prestige Group for their corporate sponsorship, which makes this podcast possible. Building cities, one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. There are 2 items that are significant to the history of Vijayanagara. Let me start with the first one, the discovery, or I should say rediscovery of Vijayanagara itself. In 1799, Tipu Sultan had just fallen to the British at Srirangapatna and the kingdom of Mysore had come into the possession of the British. Now, although the principal combatant in the Fourth War of Mysore, or the Storm of Seringapatam, was the East India Company, the kingdom would be taken over and administered directly by the crown. And this would be one of the first directly administered regions in the process of the takeover of India by the British crown. Very soon after the battle at Srirangapatna, 2 gentlemen, at the time still in the employ of the East India Company, were sent to survey the newly acquired territories of Mysore. Francis Buchanan surveyed Bangalore, Canada, and Malabar. His pages are of immense value to all Bangalore historians. And the other was Colonel Colin Mackenzie. He would come to be known as the man who mapped India in his later role as the first Surveyor General of India. In December 1799, while Mackenzie was traipsing through the areas near the banks of the river Tungabhadra, he came across the ruins at Hampi, and which came to be known as the Lost City of Vijayanagara. The tag of Lost City was probably inspired by the papers of Colin Mackenzie, where he pointed out that this once glorious city had fallen to rack and ruin, a thick overgrowth of jungle covering up its beauty, and that it came to be populated by wild beasts, including tigers. In that month, December 1799 that is, Mackenzie and his team hacked through the overgrowth at Hampi. They set up a makeshift camp in the Virupaksha temple because that was the only location that could be secured at night. And then, as they cleared the area, Mackenzie commissioned watercolor paintings of the ruins, and those are the earliest images that we have of the discovery or rediscovery of Hampi. Those wonderful paintings include royal residences and bathhouses, and even if fancy got the better of fact in the eyes of the artist, one can get more than a good idea of what it might have looked like. Now, I will show some of these images on my Instagram and other social media channels, so follow me there and look for the reels that I will post there very soon. It would be another 50 years before photography came to India, and Alexander Greenlaw photographed the ruins in 1856. And then these photographs disappeared into a private collection in the UK, and they surfaced only as late as 1980. And it goes to show how recently it is that we have come to learn anything substantive about Vijayanagara, and to prove my point, another 30 years would elapse before a rash of scholarly interest set in, and Madras archaeologist Alexander Ray got down to the lie of the land. In the early 1440s, the famous Abd al-Razak came as an ambassador from Persia to the court of Vijayanagara. But he was an unhappy and disgruntled traveler, falling sick and complaining about everything that he encountered. He later wrote this about his sea voyage. When the smell of the ship reached my nostrils and I felt the terror of the sea, I lost consciousness so completely that for 3 days I was dead to the world, except for the rising and falling of my breath. Now, Abdur Razak's mood may have been made worse by some merchants on his ship complaining loudly that the best time to make the sea voyage had long passed. Razak then reached Calicut, and for whatever reason, he complained that the society of Kerala in Calicut was matrilineal and polyandrous. There's no making this man happy. But eventually, Razak set his eyes on Vijayanagara, and here he became enthralled. Razak's chronicles served as a guide for Ray's work on the layout of the ancient kingdom. Alexander Ray was from the newly formed archaeological department in Madras. So everything was methodical. They followed a study and a log of everything they found there, including inscriptions and the oral histories of residents and temple priests. And all of this became the basis for what was the most significant work on Vijayanagara, Robert Sewell's book, A Forgotten Empire. Later historians have improved on whatever these early scholars worked on, and indeed, one of them, George Michel, suggested in an essay that Vijayanagara was a never-forgotten city, having cast its spell on the world for centuries. Like the origins of most kingdoms that have become popular enough to inspire folklore, the Vijayanagara Empire has had its share. Sewell records that there are no fewer than 11 theories and stories about the origins and the foundings of the kingdom. Inevitably, there's the one about the rabbit that chased the dog. There's always a hare and a dog in Deccan folklore, and this one astonished Harihara into building a city in honor of this act of leporine bravery. As Sewell writes, this tale is told of the rise of almost every kingdom, principality or large zamindari in southern India, the usual variant being the discovery of hidden treasure. And then there's the story that attracts more reverence, and that one concerns the sage Vidyaranya, who is said to have inspired the building of the city. The trouble with all these stories is not whether or not they were true or even probable, but that they suggested that the building of Hampi started at that point. The rabbit and dog story brings up images of a thickly wooded place that may needed to have been leveled for construction. But however fanciful these stories are, in reality, Hampi had existed for a long time before 1336. The regions on the bank of the Tungabhadra were already a sacred landscape dotted with temples, and many of these temples predate the Vijayanagara period, suggesting that the area had held religious significance long before it became a political capital. So Vijayanagara wasn't exactly built on empty landscape. It was the continuation of an already sacred and historically significant place, and its founders didn't create a city from scratch. They expanded upon an existing infrastructure, existing religious and cultural basis. There are many other minor to major arguments that center around which year it is said to have been founded, and the famous argument is, was it 1336 or was it 1346? Epigraphical evidence points to one, tales, fables, and devotional fervor lead some to lean towards the other, but this debate is hardly material except in an academic sense, so I'm going to move right past it. The history of the Deccan has, over the years, benefited much from the tales of travelers, scholars from different parts of the world. The list is long and extends from observers in the time of campaigns of Alexander through the time of Buddhist scholars like Fayan Xuanzang to Marco Polo in the 13th century and others. And of the chroniclers that Vijayanagara had attracted in the 15th and 16th centuries, the most quoted scholars included Abdur Razak Samarkandi, Nicolai da Conti, Fernão Nunes, and Domingo Pais. The volume and frequency of historical accounts had grown substantially by this time, and importantly, the difference between the histories of the earlier periods in the Deccan and this is that the record of historical accounts around Vijayanagara were almost entirely contemporary, first-hand accounts by these travelers, for instance. That said, there were still a number of gaps and hiding places that historians and analysts could fill with their own supposition and biases, and that is something that continues to this day. The good thing is that the plausible records available are more than enough to get a pretty good picture of the history of the time. It was in 1897 that David Lopez translated the chronicles of Nunes and Pais. His translation formed the basis for a lot of what Robert Sewell wrote in The Forgotten Empire. Lopez's book was titled Dos Reis de Bisnaga, or The Kings of Bisnaga. Bisnaga was the way they pronounced Vijayanagara, and much of the work focused on the reign of Krishnadevaraya in the early 1500s. The other matter is the origins of the dynasty, and we can dismiss the hare and dog tale quite easily, but going past the legend of the sage Vidyaranya being the reason for Vijayanagara being built takes a little more effort. Of all the tales and stories that are available on the origins of Vijayanagara, there are no fewer than 7 variations of the story involving Vidyaranya. These include stories that the brothers Harihara and Bukka were employed in the Warangal kingdom and had to flee. And then they met Vidyaranya, who exhorted them to set up the city, and the rest is history. And then there are other theories. One of them is that the brothers were captured by the Sultanate, converted to Islam, and sent as vassals of the Sultanate to Vijayanagara. Another opinion has it that Harihara was a general under Veerabalala. The trouble with all of these stories is that we don't know what parts of the stories are true, if any of them are entirely true, or parts of them are true, or if there's any truth in any of this in the first place. And then there's the matter of whether or not they were Telugu-speaking or Kannada-speaking, and a litany of complaints and counter-complaints about the name itself. All of these debates follow independent streams of thought. There's no evidence of any one of them being true, as I said, and only circumstantial evidence of any part of any version being true. So some of these accounts are embraced by those who are spiritually inclined to believe them, but the hare, hound, and hermit theories don't really stand up to any logic and evidence. And by the same token, I'm also skipping all the narratives relating to Hampi being the scene or the location for events in the Ramayana. Gun held to the head, if we were asked to pick one account, Robert Sewell favors the explanation that the brothers were from Warangal, they fled the Sultanate forces and took refuge with the local Raja of Anegundi. Anegundi is a small little principality in the area, and then Anegundi fell to the Sultanate, but eventually they handed the kingdom back and elevated Harihara I, or Hakka as he's called, and his brother Bukka to the position of Raja and Minister, respectively. Now let me say that what I have outlined here is only a small part of the debates and discussions on the theories of Vijayanagara origins. The history of Vijayanagara has been pulled into all sorts of proxy battles, with one side who framed their political biases on the Vijayanagara history, the most common among them being the rise of religious-based neo-nationalism, and the other side take on a more commonsensical approach to determining a nuanced understanding of Vijayanagara's history, moving beyond these simple-minded communal narratives. It can all get tiresome for the layperson, but when all this is done and dusted, we can move into the history of Vijayanagara. And now for a commercial break, but when I come back, let's dive into Vijayanagara history and find out what was going on in the region right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hello, I'm back. In the segment before the break, I had mentioned that there were 2 items of significance, and all this time I went over the first one. The second one is that the politics of the south had changed forever with the coming of the Sultanate forces. Until now, and right from the 4th century if you like, the Deccan had seen the succession of several empires that had been ruled by either Jain or predominantly Hindu families. These were independent kingdoms, often at war with each other and governed by what seems to be somewhat unruly politics. Alliances were made and broken on commercial and political expediency. Religion did lurk in the back of everyone's minds, but there was a sense of the secular, judging by the openness of the rulers to live and let live, alongside the many international and homegrown faiths that had been present in all the kingdoms till date. For example, the Rashtrakuta capital Manyaketa during Govinda III's reign boasted of as many as 5 mosques built for the Arab traders in the mid-9th century, and that was 600 years before our present time, which is the 15th century, and definitely centuries before the Ghurid invasions in the north. And there were always at least 3 centers of power across the south, the Karnataka, Telugu and Tamil kingdoms being the principal centers, with different families and different dynasties being the predominant one at the time. And politics, as I said, had always been unruly, with each of these ruling kingdoms constantly looking over their shoulder to see where the next attack would come from, either internally or externally, or being the perpetrators of attacks on neighboring kingdoms. And now, with the Sultanate coming into the picture, things were changing. More recently, as we saw from the last episode, Veera Ballala III had tried his hand at unifying the south. And it didn't work, but maybe that effort was one step towards creating awareness. But when it looked like the Sultanate might conquer the whole south, the southern kingdom suddenly saw a reason to unite against a common enemy, the common threat. By the time the Vijayanagara Empire had been established for real, there was nothing left of the great empires of the south. So, ironically, the south became unified under the Vijayanagara Empire, if only by default. And the default, if I may call it that, was because of the internal preoccupations of the Sultanate Delhi and their difficulty in maintaining a strong administrative grip on countries so far south. And in the period between the start of the troubles of the Sultanate and their eventual fall to the Mughals, Vijayanagara flourished. Now let's get a bird's eye view of Vijayanagara politics. The Vijayanagara era was composed of 4 distinct dynasties, and those were the Sangama dynasty starting in 1336, which is where we are now, the Saluba dynasty in 1485, the Tuluba dynasty in 1491, and the Aravidu dynasty in 1542 that lasted up to 1646. But let's kick things off with the Sangama dynasty. The story starts in 1336. We know very little about this gentleman Sangama, but he had 5 sons. They were Harihara, Bukka, Kampana, Marappa and Muddappa. Harihara, aka Hakka, and his brother Bukka being the notable ones. So modest and quiet was the beginning of Harihara's rule that some early inscriptions refer to Harihara as a Mahamandaleshwara, which means viceroy or general, and not as a king. And this was even true during the early part of Bukka's reign. And the one reason for this is likely the towering presence of the Hoysalas, particularly Veera Ballala III, between 1336 when Vijayanagara swam into view and 1343 when Ballala was killed near Madurai. And this, of course, gives credence to the theory that the brothers had worked for Ballala. According to the Portuguese chronicler Nunez, Harihara ruled for 7 years. His main aim after founding the kingdom was to stabilize it. This was not unusual for the founders of empire. They usually try to set things in place after having created it, and the fireworks usually start with the next in line. If Nunez was right, Harihara would have died around 1343. Childless, he was succeeded by his younger brother Bukka, and this was a famous Vijayanagara ruler. If we pursue what Hakka and Bukka may have inherited, we can glean something by inference and elimination. For example, Harihara is said to have been in control over a large area even by 1340. There is evidence that his territory stretched as far north as the Kaladgi district beyond the Malaprabha river. Now, there was a fort built at Badami with his permission, proving that he held control over the region. Now, what's telling about this is that this territory had been taken over by Tughlaq, which could only have been in recent years. So therefore, if this territory came into the hands of Harihara in 1340, it means that it had devolved to him by default. The question is, how much did he have to fight for? And by this I surmise that the coming together of 3 causes, the fall of the great kingdoms of the south, the weakening of the Sultanate's attention to the south owing to their own internal problems in Delhi, and lastly, the high level of fragmentation of local principalities, And that would have resulted from the fall of all of these overlords and all of these kingdoms all at once. The situation needed a leader, an anchor. The continuous creation of wealth from trade needed a repository. The fragmented principalities around the Deccan needed an overlord, someone who could represent their common interests in a federal sense. There had always been more than one such center of power in the Deccan, as I mentioned, but the Sultanate had destroyed all these power bases, and they were not around to fulfill the role of overlords in any efficient or effective way. There was a vacuum in the Deccan, and to become the dominant power in the south, Vijayanagara did not have to engage in grand battle and bloodshed. They simply filled that vacuum. This episode was an introduction to an overview of the beginnings of the Vijayanagara kingdom, and the next episodes will be a summary of their history with references to the Bangalore region. And more exciting history is coming your way right here. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.